Hello, this is Craig DeLarge, here recording notes for part 1 of 2 of the NAMI PA Mainline Forum on Ambiguous Loss, based on the book Ambiguous Loss by Dr. Pauline Boss. Dr. Pauline Boss is an emeritus professor at the University of Minnesota, and for all intent and purposes is the creator of this concept of ambiguous loss that we'll be talking about today. At the bottom of this slide, you see a link for videos that you can find on YouTube where Dr. Boss is being interviewed. We encourage you to take a look at those. So to start with the definition, ambiguous loss is loss that does not have closure, social acknowledgement, or ritual, or normal means of coping and grieving. When we talk about ambiguous loss, we're talking about a type of loss as different from ordinary loss. This is a type of loss that is particularly suffered by people who are caregivers of the mentally ill, which was the key reason why we decided to feature this topic in one of our forums. When we talk about ambiguous loss, there are two types. Type 1, which has to do with loved ones who are physically absent but psychologically present for us. This might be the case of having a loved one who's disappeared, who is transient or homeless. You think about them day in and day out, but they're not physically with you. Type 2 ambiguous loss has to do with a situation where a loved one is physically present but psychologically absent. This is the case when we are caregivers of loved ones who have degrees of dementia, bipolar, where it is difficult to communicate or be present with them, or schizophrenia, where their hallucinations take them away from us. By its very nature, ambiguous loss is stressful. It torments us, leaves us confused, puts us in a situation that is largely uncontrollable, at least in our perception, where there is not a clear understanding of when the loss will be resolved and come to closure. It exhausts us in every way, from physical to psychological to emotional, leaves us feeling guilty as to our lack of control and power in the situation, and creates a great deal of emotional and psychological conflict within us. One of the reasons that we again wanted to cover this topic in our forums is we found it very helpful to be able to put a label and a name to what we were all collectively feeling and struggling with, but at times are at a loss as to understand how to describe it, to validate it, and to cope with it. So when we look deeper at the characteristics of ambiguous loss, we see that it is a relational disorder, not an individual pathology, and that the problems related to ambiguous loss have more to do with the situation than it has to do with our psyches. One of the things that Dr. Boss says in this book is that in situations of ambiguous loss, it is not so much the family and the individuals that are sick as the situation itself. Given this, it follows that one of the best ways of coping with ambiguous loss is in a family or community-based setting and interventions as distinct from individual therapy. So when we look further at specific examples of the different types of ambiguous loss, type 1, physical absence versus type 2, psychological absence, we've listed here the different types that are common. You see under type 1 examples of missing loved ones, whether it's from abduction, the military. And it was quite interesting in this book to come across the fact that even families and individuals that are struggling with young adults leaving home, going off to college, or even the military for that matter, can set up instances of ambiguous loss in grieving that often the family is not really recognizing as they should and equipping themselves to really deal with this. Examples further being missing because of war or terrorism or natural disaster, as we are so much witnessing in the news on a regular basis, that families lose not only their possessions, but loved ones, sometimes not knowing where they are, if they're still alive, or if they will ever be back as it relates to natural disaster. Type 1 ambiguous loss also takes the form of abandonment, whether this is abandonments early in life that are unresolved, or abandonments that take place in more present times in life. People who are adopted oftentimes are dealing with a sense of ambiguous loss, wondering why they were given up and where their original family is. And one of the things that Dr. Boss talks about a great deal in her book, which is her own personal experience that brought this whole topic up for her in her life, was the idea of ambiguous loss related to immigration, where individuals and family members are torn asunder as one goes off to some new world and others are left in the old world, and there is not the same degree of contact as they are both in their separate existences and feeling the loss of not having access to one another anymore. When we then look at the detailed types of type 2 loss or psychological absence, we see examples of dementia and Alzheimer's, as we discussed before, mental illness, which is the particular context of those that participated in this forum, but even brain injury, chronic illness, autism, depression, addiction, and surprisingly enough, workaholism. A situation where a loved one, because of their preoccupation with work, can be physically present for their family, but because of their preoccupation are psychologically absent. I had underestimated the degree that this particular life habit can inflict a sense of ambiguous loss on spouses, children, and other family members. So then, when we look at the various types of things that sufferers of ambiguous loss deal with in particular, we see that they are typically denied the rituals and acknowledgement of closure that is typically accorded to members of a society when they are dealing with ordinary loss. And very often, because of the nature of the loss, particularly when we're talking about mental illness, issues of stigma are very much present and are part of the process of denial of closure that occurs with people who are suffering with ambiguous loss. The other thing that we see kind of going hand in hand with stigmatization is that there is a denial of emotional and social support, as in our society we typically don't have rituals of closure for situations of loss where the loss itself cannot be verified. We see that sufferers of ambiguous loss are expected to carry on as normal, even though there's a great deal of uncertainty and even grieving in their lives. Again, society not understanding the situation that these individuals are going through. One of the things that creates a lot of stress and conflict for people who struggle with ambiguous loss is the experience of dark emotions. Grief, doubt, guilt, anger, fear, anxiety, and depression that is brought on because of the loss that they are suffering themselves. Feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. Feelings of isolation, particularly when the loss is related to a stigmatized area. Over time, exhaustion of both physical, psychological, and emotional nature. A coping mechanism that a response mechanism that some sufferers of ambiguous loss use is that of ambivalence, because they don't know whether their loved one is going to be coming back or not. They can go to extremes of being continuously preoccupied with their loved ones, or actually going to the other extreme of behaving as though their loved one does not exist anymore. One of the things that Dr. Boss talks about in the book is that sufferers of ambiguous loss can in fact be dealing with symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, but in this case there is no post. It is traumatic stress disorder because sufferers of ambiguous loss are in fact not in a post state. They are not on the other side of their loss, but are dealing with their loss even as it is occurring. Because ambiguous loss forces on anyone a rethinking of the structure of the family, sufferers of ambiguous loss are faced with determining how their missing loved one, whether physical or psychological, actually fits into the family, and are often tempted with withdrawing from that loved one, even when they are physically present. The other thing that sufferers of ambiguous loss deal with is responsibility boundaries. One of the most challenging things M. Scott Peck says in the book, The Road Less Traveled, that we have to deal with in life is understanding the degree to which we should take responsibility for others or not. And this is something that becomes particularly exasperating for people who find themselves in this situation, as, say, when you have a loved one who has mental illness or a chronic illness, you really are continuously in a quandary as to the degree to which they are capable versus not, and by extension, the degree to which you should take the responsibility for their lives versus not. What can come with this uncertainty is a certain immobilization owing to the ambiguity of the situation. And so, again, these are things that people who suffer with ambiguous loss often cope with.